Jesus that Immanuel Kant found particularly objectionable. Today, it's, other than Kant, it's generally some of Jesus' more admired teaching, though I would say quite rarely practiced, even among those who ascribe to him sort of a divine or deity status. So the external moves to the internal, and Jesus in Matthew's Gospel says, let me give you an example. He says, you have heard it said that if a man divorces his wife and marries another, then that man is committing adultery. But, he says, I'm telling you, if a man merely looks at a woman other than his wife in a lustful or desirous way, he has already committed adultery. And then it says, in his heart. Entekardia in Greek, it could mean heart in the sense of organ, but it's probably a figurative term like we would use heart, his inner being. There again, the ethic has moved from the external act to an internal perspective. This is hinted at in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, from time to time, but it obviously was never at the forefront. And in the days of Jesus, those who were called the Pharisees, who frankly remind me of lots of the people I grew up around, those people who were called the Pharisees were recognized as the greatest experts in the law. So they didn't take it this way. Moses didn't say such things, but Jesus comes along, and there's a radical shift from the external to the internal, and it leads us to the second one, that there is also in the ethic of Jesus a shift from law to love. So, speaking of the subject of adultery, in the Gospel of John, there's a very famous story told in the first 11 or 12 verses of the Gospel of John chapter 8. It really begins in the last verse of chapter 7. So it's, I suppose the reference would be John 7:53 through 8:11, give or take a verse. The story is told there of the woman taken in adultery. And the story says that the religious leaders bring a woman to Jesus and they say, now what do you say we should do? Because we caught this woman in the very act of adultery. And according to the law, she should be stoned to death. Well, this is the famous story where Jesus sort of almost ignores him, and he writes something in the sand. He's scratching on the ground, and there have been all sorts of theories what he has written there. The text itself doesn't say. But he does enter the discussion eventually, and he says, okay, if you're going to enforce this law, and they have, the Greek text says they've taken up the stones to begin the execution. He says, if you're going to enforce this law, then whoever has not sinned can be the first one to throw the first rock. Then it says that one by one, beginning, interestingly, the Greek text says, beginning with the eldest down to the youngest, they all put the stones down and walked away. It's interesting that it mentions the beginning from the eldest to the youngest. I think there's some value in that as well. Jesus' point there almost upends the law of Moses. It sort of suspends its application by implying, well, there's no one here fit to be judge, jury, or executioner. It will come later in other passages I will show you when Jesus just plain flat out contradicts the law of Moses. But the example in John 8 is one of those where he clearly, here is what the law says, and says, if you're going to try to live this way, then let the sinless begin the execution process. As a side note, for those of you who are church folks or students of the New Testament, in the New Testament there are only two large passages where the authenticity of the text is disputed. And that story of the woman in adultery is one. It's about a 12-verse passage. And then the other is what is called the longer ending of Mark, which is also about a 12-verse passage that is disputed. Where does the book of Mark actually end? Those are the two longest textual variations in the New Testament. Jesus says, if you are without sin, then you cast the first stone. So beginning with the oldest to the youngest, they put the stones down and they leave. Except then, of course, Jesus is left with the woman alone, which itself was something rather radical. But it's not unusual in John's Gospel, because on more than one occasion, Jesus is alone with a woman in John's Gospel. The more famous event, I suppose, is John chapter 4, when he stops at the well at Samaria and tells her to get him something to drink. It starts in a rather patriarchal sort of, which was probably what she had expected, and it turns out to be an interesting conversation. But in John 8, where he's alone with the woman, Jesus says, well, woman, where are your accusers? Her name's never given. Woman, where are your accusers? And she looks around and says, well, there's no one here to condemn me. And he says, neither do I condemn you. That's the famous part of it. But he does add in John's text, go and sin no more. The more I'm studying this and making notes to myself, I'm realizing that in the ethic of Jesus, as expressed in the New Testament, and that's where I have to go to figure it out, okay? I can't try to tell you the ethic of Jesus on the basis of what Pat Robertson says, even though much of Jesus' time is taking up talking with Pat and several other people, okay? I'm doing this on the basis of the text, so I would like to be at least credited with recognizing the value of the text. And when you read the text, the woman says, there are no accusers, and Jesus says, well, then go. But he also says, sin no more. I find actually the ethic of Jesus is simultaneously far more challenging and demanding than anything in prior Hebrew tradition. But it's also much more lenient in recognizing that when you set this high of a standard, people don't reach it. In probably the most challenging of all of Jesus' utterances is the short utterance, the aphorism in the Gospel of Matthew only, where Jesus says, be as perfect as God in heaven is perfect. That's, I suppose, for a theist, for a Jewish theist, certainly the ultimate standard of perfection. So this shift goes from the external to the internal, and it moves from law to love. Now, in the case of the woman taken in adultery, Jesus recognizes what Moses would do. He doesn't say in John, he doesn't say, well, it's not that way anymore. He says, essentially, fine, if you want to put the woman to death, then let's have the innocent start the stoning, and everybody leaves. But it gets really more obvious in other places in the Gospel of Matthew when Jesus plainly says that the teaching of Moses is no longer valid. And that series of examples of the paradigm shift from law to love is very, very fruitful material. When you study, say, a beginning ethics course, and obviously many of you have or are, you start talking about things like retributivism, lex talionis. You're often given that little quote attributed to Moses, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Even famous, real conservative ethicists, philosophers like Louis Poyman, for example, loved that passage. He says, well, even the Bible says. That is true that Moses says that. Comes from the Old Covenant. But Jesus plainly says in the New Covenant, it's not that way anymore. In fact, there's a whole series in Matthew's Gospel. There's an artistry to Matthew that, unfortunately, a rather fundamentalist reading doesn't appreciate. I used to teach in another state a course on literary approaches to the Bible. It was actually a literature course. The Bible is literature, and one of my master's degrees is in religious literature. There's an artistry that comes through when you study things in a sort of literary way and step back and detach yourself from, say, a fundamental or a confessional sort of stance. Jesus is clearly, for Matthew, the new Moses and the better Moses. He mediates a better covenant, he lives it better, he teaches it better. He corrects the things where, according to Matthew, Moses failed. It's interesting, of course, Moses' greatest ethical revelation is supposedly reached in Exodus 19 and 20 when he goes to the mountain and he comes back with the 10 Commandments. Lest you forget those 10 Commandments, it's okay. All you need to do is drive over to Posey County and they have them on display in front of the courthouse. Okay? The commandment that treats the wife on the same status as someone's donkey and so forth. Okay? That's what's in the 10 Commandments. To me, it's rather hysterical. Because I have a lot of people that say, oh, you got to keep the commandments. Actually, if you enumerate them, the Old Testament has 613 commandments. And they include some very famous ones, like no other gods, because it says God is jealous. But it also includes some very obscure ones, like commandments about what you must do if you find mold in your house. And it goes on for most of an entire chapter in the book of Leviticus. Matthew's gospel. See, Matthew goes to the mountain, he gets these great commandments, and Jesus makes his greatest sermon in Matthew's gospel, the Sermon on the Mount. And he goes to the mountain and offers his ethic. There are 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. There are 5 extended ethical discourses of Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew. It's quite clear to me that Matthew, whoever the author was, that Matthew is presenting Jesus as the new covenant ethicist, the Moses of the new covenant, and the shift is clearly from law to love. He says, it used to be an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, not that way anymore. He says if someone strikes you, you don't strike that person back, rather you allow him to strike the other cheek. If someone curses you, you turn around and bless that person. If someone forces you, compel, King James, to go 1 mile, you go 2 miles. If he takes 1 garment, you give him 2 garments. Essentially, it's actually twice as demanding in its expectations, but it's also more prone to graciousness and forgiveness. And while the external and the legal were emphasized in the traditional Mosaic framework, the paradigm shift for Jesus is to the internal and to love. In fact, it's inextricably bound in Jesus' teaching in this famous story where a very wise man comes to Jesus and says, well, Master, you know the commandments. Tell me what's the greatest of the commandments. And Jesus quotes Moses, Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. Called the Shema, or Shema in Hebrew. It's Deuteronomy 6:4. It's the most famous verse in the entire Hebrew Bible. It's the most quoted verse in the Hebrew Bible. More so even than Genesis 1:1, which they enjoy quoting. If you go down, some of you have been down to Kentucky to the Creation Museum and so forth, and they're emphasizing. But clearly in Judaism, the most important verse is Deuteronomy 6:4. And Jesus says that's the first commandment of all. But then he says, but there's a second commandment that's very closely related to it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And that actually also comes from the law of Moses in the book of Leviticus. But it's tucked away deep in the midst of the book of Leviticus in a string of the most obscure, and I would say contemporarily irrelevant of commands. The verse, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, is surrounded in Leviticus by other important moral teachings such as these. You cannot grow 2 different kinds of seed in the same garden. You cannot wear a garment made of 2 different kinds of fibers. I have this nice and ungodly cotton polyester blend. You cannot let 2 different kinds of cattle graze in the same pasture. I see this happening all the time, even on people whose farms sometimes have little Christian symbols. And tucked away in that very chapter is a verse that says, love your neighbor as yourself. So there's clearly in Jesus' paradigm this shift from law to love. He doesn't repeat the others about the cattle and the seeds and the fibers. But he isolates the one in love. in this regard, I rather compare Jesus to an earlier religious, if one may use that, I think philosophical